Right.
which is fun. I'll go ahead and admit the folks that are in the waiting room right now.
Okay.
We'll see if any of them happen to be Chris. All right, welcome everyone. Real quick, we have 2 pages here. One is the actual page from Door County Land Trust. I'm curious who the other page is. Where's the other person whose name shows up
Well,
this
it looks like
page?
Paige, you're signed in twice.
Yep.
All right, second page, I don't know if you said anything, but I couldn't hear you. It might just remain a mystery. We'll give it another minute just to see if anyone pops in. If not, we'll go ahead and get started.
Yeah. And feel free to put your name in the chat, or if you know how to change your name on Zoom, that would be helpful too. But yeah, that is difficult for whatever reason.
Now, I do have this meeting being recorded, so if you would prefer not to have your face being recorded, feel free to keep your camera off. Otherwise, feel free to turn it on. I would ask that folks stay muted if you're not one of the presenters, just to avoid background noise interfering with things. Today we have Paige Wideck from the Door County Land Trust. She's essentially my counterpart there, their community conservation coordinator. And we also have Mark Glasser, who is one of the Preserve Stewards up at Door County. And we joined us as well to talk about his role in that program. It's a bit of background for our Door County folks before I turn it over to them. Here in our land trust, we focus on kind of the Green Bay watershed area. So we do work down in Appleton area, up through Green Bay, up even as far north as Oconto, kind of all throughout that watershed. Here in Wisconsin, about 12 counties or so. Got about 9 to 11 different public preserves. Kind of depends on how you count them. Some of the preserves are like right next to each other. So is it a case of 1 property or 2 properties? Depends who you ask. But about 9 different areas that we work with. They're publicly accessible that we're trying to promote to the public and manage as nature preserves. So we are looking to try to build up our own preserve stewardship program, try to engage the volunteers to help caretake for those preserves, help to manage them, and help to connect the general public with them as well. Obviously, this is a type of program that you all have well established, and that a lot of other land trusts have something similar going. So we're at the stage of trying to learn more about what other land trusts are doing for their specific programs, kind of for my own learning, as well as for the learning of our general community, being able to learn more about what this type of program involves, and then help to visualize on our end how this might look for our land trust and our particular needs. But we have one more person is here. All right, so with that brief introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Paige as a brief presentation to go through, to talk about some of the preserve stewardship aspects. I'll have some questions for Paige and Mark just to get some discussion going, and then we'll have time for any questions from the audience at the end.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, and feel free to put questions in the chat. I won't be able to see the chat really well while this present PowerPoint is up, but feel free to just if that makes you feel more comfortable, or raise your hand or whatever. I'm happy to answer questions throughout. I thought I put together this brief PowerPoint presentation so you weren't just listening to me talk, but we got some pictures and some context. This is a fun picture of our group at our spring training that we hold every year now for the Preserve Stewards. Just mainly, honestly, the big point is to get everybody together because we do have, I believe it's around, I meant to look up the exact number, but I believe there are around 35 different volunteers that watch over different pieces of land. And to give some context to the Door County Land Trust, we protect over 9,600 acres right now. We're very proud of that number. If you're familiar with Door County, there's 5 state parks in Door County, and that acreage is just about the same as those 5 state parks combined. So to give a sense of scale. Of those 9,600 acres, a little over 5,000, I believe, are what we call our fee lands. So those are lands that the Door County Land Trust owns and manages. And the other, the remaining acreage, or a good portion of that, is through conservation easements, which I'm not going to go into a whole lot about what that is, because if you're familiar with Northeastern Wisconsin Land Trust, I'm sure you know a little bit about that too. But so essentially, when we're talking about lands that the land trust is looking to get Preserve stewards on, for help being an eyes and ears out there, we're talking kind of about that 5,000 acres that we own and manage. And of those, we have different kind of what we call nature preserves and natural areas. And I won't, if people are curious about that, I can go into that difference. But essentially, our nature preserves are places we have on our hiking map that people can go and visit, that have infrastructure. They have trails there, they have a welcome kiosk, and natural areas are in a much more rustic state. So there may be a trail there, but it may not be as well maintained and or have as much signage, and there's usually not great places to park near that property. And that's for a variety of different reasons. So typically those are smaller properties, smaller parcels. They may be really ecologically significant, so they may not be able to hold kind of the impact of having a trail on them, or they're landlocked, so access to them is really difficult. So a variety of reasons. But this is I just like this picture of this group of wonderful volunteers that we get to work with that help us steward our lands. And I think Mark is in there. Yeah. Oh yeah, he's over towards the end there. But I just wanted to give this brief presentation, just overall, like, what is a Preserve steward, at least in terms of how the Door County Land Trust views it. So we have a volunteer position description. I'm just going to go over a brief, a few different aspects of that volunteer position description. So the purpose or objective of our Preserve stewards are essentially to be our eyes and ears on the property. So we have limited stewardship staff, and being out on and watching over those various properties is very difficult for the staff to be out there all the time to see what's going on. And so volunteers that live near the preserves or are willing to go there and visit there regularly are essential for us to know just like what's happening out there, both if there are any issues, but also if there are any really cool things happening. Like, for example, I'll talk about examples later, but so they're assisting in stewarding our lands by serving as the eyes, ears, and general point person for a specific nature preserve. So everybody has a specific property that they're quote unquote assigned to. But usually that has a lot to do with where they're located, or just a property that they feel very connected to. They're going to collaborate with staff to plan and execute stewardship projects and tasks for the preserve. So it's very much a partnership in that sense, and communicate, engage others interested in assisting with land stewardship tasks at Land Trust Preserves. And I'm glad Mark is on here today, because I believe he's talked. I believe you've brought in some of our volunteer Preserve stewards by talking to folks about the opportunity. So it's very basic. So, and when they're reporting, so these are just some pictures that volunteers have sent me, just things that they're letting us know if there's a damaged sign. So this one's really rough from one on Washington Island. This needs to get replaced. This is pretty useless in this state. If there are invasives present on the property, so this is a picture of some Phragmites. And sometimes staff already know about it, but it's good that, you know, we're communicating about these things. Or a very common thing is there are some trees down over the trail. But it also might be something cool, like one Preserve steward let us know that they think there's evidence of like a badger on one of our preserves, which was really cool because we didn't know that if that was out there, and different things like that. So some key responsibilities. So they're providing staff with this periodic observation report of the preserves, any progress or work done on there. So that can just be like walking the trails, and again, making sure no trees are down, the signs look good. We typically ask depending if they're on a nature preserve, so a place that gets frequented a lot by the public, we typically ask our preserve stewards to go out at least once a month, especially during the summer season, which is a very busy season up here in Door County, but just in general, I think for nature preserves in Wisconsin. And if it's a natural area, maybe once every 3 months or something. So it can be a pretty low commitment, but some people really love their preserve and they go out almost every day. So it's really up to the volunteer. And then adhere to our safety policies and our preserve use guidelines and rules, and work with staff to identify and prioritize and plan some tasks to be conducted on the preserve. So in terms of experience, our preserve stewards range in a wide variety of experiences. We really just ask that volunteers are willing to adhere to these guidelines and these responsibilities, and that they are passionate about the outdoors and being outside in the place that they are stewarding, and willing to communicate with staff. So there's not a whole lot of background knowledge that is necessary. So I don't know if anybody has any questions, feel free to put those in. But yeah, so that's kind of like, I hope that is somewhat clear as to like what the preserve stewards are. What do I mean when I say that? So these are volunteers that go out there and their eyes and ears on these different plant lands. And I think that might be all I'll share for now. I had some other slides, but I don't think they're as relevant to this group. They're just kind of about how we use some reporting we do and things like that. But that's kind of the general thing. But I'd love, if I can, Paul, I might introduce Mark, and maybe he can talk a little bit about his experience, because he has been a preserve steward for longer than I've been with the Land Trust, and kind of overseeing the preserve steward program. So Mark is an excellent volunteer, and I'll, take it away, Mark. What property do you do and what do you do out there?
Well, just to introduce myself, I got my start in volunteering on trails with the Ice Age National Scenic Trail. And I was down in Waukesha County. And at that time, I was assigned a segment of that trail. And so I've worked over 10 years now with the Ice Age Trail Alliance, which is their organizational body, doing trail maintenance projects, either with other people or being responsible for a specific segment of the trail. And then 4 or 5 years ago, began volunteering with the Door County Land Trust to help them maintain trails and work on different projects that come up throughout the year with the Land Trust. And in addition to that, I also volunteer at Newport State Park and the Nature Conservancy in the Clearing to help work with different trails and outdoor activities, with the focus on trying to coordinate volunteers and help them have a productive and fun workday whenever they get together to work on different projects. But I have a question for Paul now, and that would be, perhaps you could describe for me what it is you would like the volunteers in your organization to be doing. Just maybe describe what kind of thoughts you have on what you would like the volunteers to be doing.
Yeah, so definitely kind of the core component, or kind of the most essential one, is, like Paige said, getting those eyes and ears on our different preserves. Because they're ones, up in as far as Green Bay, up in Oconto, further area than I can travel on a very convenient basis. And definitely further than I can get out on any sort of frequency to be able to keep an eye on what the condition of the preserves is, any of those the issues that need to be aware of, whether it's an invasive species that's, taking root, or trees that are down by the entrance, or signage being damaged, things of that sort. So if that core component is getting that monitoring on the preserve, we're required by law at least to monitor each of our own properties once per year, which is something I've done for the past year and we'll probably try to do again this year. But ideally, being able to share that responsibility with others to go not only just monitoring once per year for the bare minimum, but having some more regular presence out on the preserves to be able to keep an eye on things. So at least my kind of core goal. Beyond that, kind of partly, I'd like to see it grow beyond just, keep reporting on things once a year, but hard to say exactly how it might grow. One possibility would be focusing on some more on ecological monitoring, getting some more folks involved in not just keep an eye on conditions of things or any encroachment of nearby landowners or things of that sort, but more ecological sense of monitoring what's growing on the preserves, what animals are out there, just to help us get a better sense of the biodiversity on our lands that we protect. That could be one angle that I could see Preserve Stewards trying to help out more, kind of increase that data that we have about what's on our preserves. Another angle could be trying to help promote community engagement on the preserves, whether it's helping with different tours, hikes, other activities that take place out on these lands, being able to kind of promote them and help me facilitate them, or even help facilitate these activities themselves. If they're able of doing that sort of thing. So that could be another possible direction I see it going. Thirdly, at the moment, most of our lands don't require much in the way of management. A lot of them, we protect them as natural areas and we're just trying to keep them that way. There are definitely couple properties that need some more active management that we're working on building up towards that. But for a lot of them, don't need anything too much. But it could be something where we try to, start developing some of those things. It might not need active management, but there could be things we could do to improve the property. Or it could be things where, like seed collection from some of our sites, or other things where you can collect from these properties and help to share that resource with other natural areas. So definitely those are kind of the 3 areas I could see Preserve Stewards starting to develop. Part of what I'm hoping to do after this conversation is meet with people that are interested in this sort of program, be able to discuss, what directions other people would be interested in going. Because ideally, we take it in a direction that is of most interest to the people interested in participating in this program. So that's going to be a follow-up discussion I'm hoping to have sometime maybe November or so, starting to kind of meet with those people, plan this out over the coming year, and by next year really get this program underway to do not only just the monitoring, but start to at least lay the groundwork for some additional involvement in the preserves. I think that answered your question. I could be wrong, though. I started rambling at some point there.
One of my observations is, as a volunteer, it helps to be able to go to a site of whatever you're going to be working on and feel like you accomplished something at the end of the day. So it helps to have something to do. So at a lot of the preserves that I work at, it's trail maintenance. It's keeping the trails open. It's making sure the signage is good. And it can be little things like oftentimes, if there's a trail, I try to keep the trails as much as possible what I call tick-free. So just trying to trim back all the bushes and shrubs so people feel more comfortable going out and walking in the woods and not feel like they're brushing up against all these ticks in Wisconsin while they go out and hike in the woods. But it's really important to have something feel like you did at the end of the day. For me, going out and just observing and saying, oh, everything looks good, it wouldn't be so fulfilling for me. I'd feel like, I want to do more, whether it's either monitoring or controlling invasive species. Sometimes it could be, counting butterflies. Sometimes it could be counting fish. It could be counting frogs. There's lots of different animals and wildlife that people get involved in terms of counting it. One of the preserves at the land trust, they have a really active group counting bats. So they got people to go out and count the bats, and been doing that for years, trying to keep a running tally on how many bats are on the preserve. So there's a lot of different ways that people can get involved, but they need something, I think, more tangible to work on. They also need to have a sense of responsibility for whatever they're doing. And so the land trust agency needs to be able to listen to the volunteers and also work in partnership with them, meaning when you have something to do on the property, make sure that the volunteer at least knows what's going to go on. But you really need to work in partnership, not in parallel, meaning the agency is doing one thing and the volunteer is doing another thing, but give people a sense of ownership of their property, and then they're more engaged there. And then one of the other things that volunteers can do is, I like to use the word ambassador. Be an ambassador, and it takes a while to figure out when to engage visitors in the area, because you don't want to be so nosy and so intrusive that people can't enjoy being outdoors. But you get a sense, if you do it enough, when's a nice time to ask somebody and what they like about the property and any ideas they have, or just engage them. And then it's interesting when you engage people, you can actually generate more volunteers that way. So I've done that just by talking to people that I meet on the trail. And now we have a new volunteer that, oh, I didn't know I could do this. And so it's a great way to build awareness for your organization. So those are just some ideas, and I'd also be happy to take any questions that anybody might have on any of those topics.
Well, I have a follow-up question for you, Mark, kind of based on what you were talking about there. Because you might have said this already, but I forget. But how long have you been? No, you did. You said you were like 5 years ago that you've been with the Land Trust?
Yes.
Some number of, yeah. Because what kind of changes have you seen in the Preserve Stewardship program over that time? Ideally, improvements that they've made over that time, but it could be negative changes too, or even just neutral changes. But how has it kind of grown? And ideally, how has it grown in the ways that you were talking about trying to bring more satisfaction to volunteers, trying to engage with them better in partnership, things of that sort?
Well, I'm not going to talk about any negative changes.
I would hope not, but you never
I wouldn't
know.
do that.
This would be an
I
awkward
may-
time to bring those up, but
No, and I don't have anything negative to say anyway.
perfect.
Well, my experience has been that the volunteer program is getting better and better over the years in terms of being engaging with the volunteers and also communicating with them, keeping them informed of opportunities, because I have a couple different things that I can do. One is work on the preserve that I'm assigned to, but also there's other Door County-wide opportunities that Paige makes us aware of. So if I want to go work in Sturgeon Bay or anywhere else in the county, I have that opportunity to do that as well.
I'd like to share too, is that as a Preserve Steward on Lautenbach Woods, this is Chris Smith speaking, by the way. It's just
Okay.
my camera isn't working, but you know, I'd just like to echo that, is that it gives you an opportunity, especially now that we've really rolled out that landscape app that we've been working with here up in Door County, has been tremendously important. And that's something I would advocate for, because that really gives the volunteers, you know, a sense of ownership of what you're doing. You're able to, you know, photograph issues. And on Lautenbach Woods, you know, one of the things I make a point of is that whenever we have high winds or a windstorm, I try to go out there as quickly as I can. And the reason being that I'm truly on the escarpment there at Lautenbach Woods. And so if we're going to have a wind event, I can guarantee that I'm going to wind up having to move or cut, you know, probably half a dozen logs that have fallen on the trail somewhere, because that's just the way that that preserve is. But the nice part about the landscape app is if I run into something that, you know, I really have no business trying to cut up or move by myself, you know, that gives me a way to tag and identify and use the GPS so that they can go out and find it and take care of it. You know, it's also nice for the fact that they're also able to, or I'm able to let them know, you know, that I've run into garlic mustard, and maybe garlic mustard in a site that they weren't aware of before. So I can let them know I've bagged it up, I've pulled it out, we've got another place that we want to watch for that. So all of that engages you. And I think, you know, it works as a two-way street. So it just brings people together.
Chris, I have
Yeah.
something funny to share with you, because your story about going out and after a big windstorm checking the trail reminds me of this volunteer with the Ice Age Trail Alliance. And this person is so active in getting down trees removed from the trail that they think he really camps out on the trail and just waits for a tree to fall so that he can be there right away to make sure the trail is open. But I mean, on a serious note, that's a sign of having engaged volunteers, people that feel like they take ownership for their property or their trail or their segment to make sure that it's a really pleasant experience for people that want to go out and explore the preserve.
And also on my trail, one of the things that's kind of fun is because Lautenbach Woods was part of a former farm, every once in a while, you find little artifacts and little things that are out on Lautenbach Woods that are evidence of, when it was a farm and old history and that's something that's really kind of fun to share with people as they come and they walk the trail, as just kind of say, we found things like pails from when they probably tapped some maple trees and that have just gotten lost and discarded in the woods. But, there's in Lautenbach Woods, there's an old, I think it's the body of a Chevy truck that's been sitting out there. And that's from, when it was farm. And so the bed of the truck is gone, but just part of the body of it. And that's a conversation piece for people when they go out and engage on that trail. And I'm sure there's just hundreds of photographs of that silly truck that's sitting out there, just, because it's something that engaged people to enjoy the trail.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm sorry for not mentioning you sooner. You showed up on Zoom as a second page, so we didn't actually know it was you. But welcome, Chris, as well. For anyone who's from our land trust, Chris is another one of the stewards that works up at Door County. So she and Mark, came to join Page today to help share some of their experiences as Preserve Stewards, since we're looking at bringing some Preserve Stewards of our own here.
I'm also a WAVE volunteer.
Oh, yes, that's the Water Action Volunteers, right?
Correct.
Could you tell us a little bit about that? Just because that's something I've been interested in trying to get connected with our land trust. We're trying to build up some of our citizen science programming. We've been using a lot of iNaturalist on our preserves, but I'm interested in exploring other opportunities as well to try to get people connected. So I'd be interested in learning more about that.
Okay, the WAVE program, or the Water Action Volunteers, is run through the University Extension. And so you get a whole separate training that brings you into citizen science for that. And we do things like we go out once a month to each of the creeks that I and my partner are monitoring. So I'm monitoring Hibbert's Creek, I'm monitoring Bear Creek, and I'm monitoring Stony Creek. So those are the three that we're working on this year. Last year
I'm just gonna interrupt Chris real quick. That is not typical. Most people only monitor one creek. Chris and her partner are extra dedicated to this,
Gotcha.
very
We're-
into
yeah,
this, and
yeah,
we're very
we're-
grateful they're willing to take on some of these properties that are located in areas that not a lot of the current Water Action volunteers are willing to travel to or
Yeah,
able to travel to.
I should probably explain how that's divided up. Door County is divided up into two halves as far as the water volunteers are concerned. So the northern half, and I'm not sure quite where the line runs. Paige probably knows. I'm guessing it probably must run somewhere around Whitefish Dunes, maybe, roughly. And so the northern half of the county, the volunteers are all under Ridges Sanctuary operates the water action there. And the coordinator down here happens to be Crossroads at Big Creek is the WAVE coordinator here. So right now I'm operating through Crossroads. And so we do everything roughly south. So my creek, or my portion of the creek, which happens to be my own personal property on Hibbert's Creek, is around Jacksonport, and then the other two creeks are way down in Southern Door. So when you get involved with the Water Action Volunteers, you'll go through training, which is the University of Wisconsin has a really nice comprehensive website and application that you take a lot of the training online, and then after each module you do a test. And and it's very well written. It's extremely well written. And then you learn to do each one of the steps that are going to be involved in your creek. So at the beginning of the season, we do basically a biotic index. And we also do that biotic index at the end of the season. So that will be coming up for the last time in October. Every time we go out, we measure the water temperature, We're measuring the width of the stream, the depths of the water across the width of the stream. We do a flow test to get a velocity of how much volume of water is going through. And then we also do a Hawk test, which is going to give us how much dissolved oxygen is in the water. We would like to, my partner and I had been hoping that we could also get some of the training to do advanced testing with nitrogen, but apparently it got too late and our names didn't get put in to be able to do that test, but we'd like to get into that for next year. And I'm hoping that we can, but we'll just have to see. But it is somewhat of a commitment of time. I will tell you that Bear Creek and Stony Creek are a little bit of a challenge just because it's roughly almost 0.8 of a mile to get back to our sites on both of those creeks. And of those two, I would say Bear Creek is maybe a bigger challenge just because of the depth of the water. Bear Creek is really, really weird. It's just strange. The depth of the creek in that one is you have to be fairly able-bodied on some of these places. So that's some kind of consideration that you maybe want to think about with your volunteers. We really probably should be wearing chest waders when we're running with Bear Creek, just because of the fact that the depths are, well, they're getting close to 4 feet in some places when you get into that creek. And at the area that we are, there are deep pools and it's also mud bottomed there. So you sink in, your footing is not real great. The other challenge on Stony Creek, that's a very rocky bottom. But the biggest challenge is getting to it because there's a vertical hill that just drops you right straight down. And, you know, and I've gotten scraped up going down the hill probably more than once, but it is a bit of a challenge to go to that creek. But once you're down there, I mean, it's, you know, it's not difficult. You know, Stony Creek is not hard to monitor at all. It's just getting to it. So that's something that you know, want to consider with your volunteers, is the ability of the volunteer to carry all that gear, because it's quite a bit of gear, and get back to the creek and get back in and out safely and be able to deal with being in the water.
Right. And both of those sites are new this year. And after
Yeah.
hearing a little bit about Chris's experience at Bear Creek, we might consider moving that site.
Yeah,
Because
it
that
might
sounds
yeah.
a little unsafe, and I did
we
not know
may-
that.
Yeah, we may want to move that site. The other thing is that that particular site at, you know, Bear Creek is just kind of weird because we've had monitoring flow on that is really strange. So I assume there must be some kind of upwelling of water there, because when we drop the tennis ball in there, the tennis ball will sit there and kind of swirl around and actually go backwards and up the creek rather than flow back down the creek. So it's just weird.
Fascinating.
But it is interesting. It is interesting observations. Also, it's very interesting observation to see how different the riparian zones are around those creeks, and you know what might be done to improve Bear Creek in some of the areas that are there. Earlier this year, when we began to do some of the cleanup of Bear Creek, I think that's going to start to make a lot of difference in that creek, because it is a high quality creek. We've gotten consistent clarity on that creek, believe it or not, and very high oxygen content.
That's great news.
We like
And-
to hear that.
Yeah, and what you can tell from hearing Chris talk and Mark talk is being a Preserve Steward and having these regular visits to these properties, really, they have a lot of knowledge. They're
Yeah.
becoming experts on at those places. and being able to share that and relay that with staff, so like, the month-to-month fluctuations of Bear Creek is not something the staff necessarily always knows, but Chris knows because she's
Yeah.
going out there every month from May through October, I believe it is, for a wave, to monitor that water flow. And so, and all those different things. So we can use that information to better manage those lands and see what we can do too. So in that sense, it really is a partnership, but it also, it's a really great way to get to know one place, to visit throughout the seasons and see
Yeah.
those changes, and different things like that.
Just one fun thing that I'm just going to quickly mention is that when we did the first biotic index on Hibbert's Creek, we were out there in, let's see, that would have been May. And it was the first time it ever happened when we did the biotic index, is we had fish hatchlings from lake trout with the yolk sac still attached. And that was the first time I ever caught that. So in any of this, so that was kind of fun to see that, hatchling come out of there. And it wasn't just one. We picked up quite a few when we did the biotic index. When we pulled that out, we had like probably half a dozen of those little guys at the net.
That's
Cool.
a lot. Yeah, I've never seen
Yeah,
fish
so it was
hatchlings
fun.
before. Nice. Yeah, definitely. And, we preserve focus on the watershed. So we have a big focus on water quality. So definitely would be interested in trying to, on our end of things, promote more of that water quality analysis, try to better understand how the lands we're protecting are impacting water quality and how we're contributing to overall water quality in the region. We also, some of our streams definitely would not be ideal sites as far as muddy bottoms and wide banks and stuff. Like the one that's most convenient location wise and probably the most needed monitoring also has a very muddy bottom that you might sink in if you tried to walk through. So I'll think about that and see if that works or not. More to come.
It can be very tricky. Yes.
Paige, I had a question for you on the staff end of things. What sort of training and support do you as a staff member try to offer to the Preserve Stewards? What sort of opportunities, things of that nature?
So I'm kind of the person that they're in regular communication with. So when they send in their reports of what they did out there, because it's very important for us as a land trust to collect those volunteer hours, because that can help with grant match funding and different things like that. So that's a big part of it. And then providing feedback and based on what's in their report. So I'm reading it over, and if there's anything in there that needs to be addressed, I'm passing that along. If it's not something that I would address, it's being passed along to our stewardship staff so that they know that information, and hopefully then also providing feedback. The stewardship staff, sometimes they're just such in a whirlwind that it can be difficult to be like, did that get addressed already? And they're like, oh yeah, or oh, I have to get to that next week or something like that. But hopefully then providing feedback to the volunteers. And then in terms of training, we do an annual training once a year, as I mentioned, with that photo at the beginning, where we try to get all of the Preserve Stewards together for a gathering, any updates with the organization. We'll typically go over just some things that is good for the Preserve Stewards to know. So usually we're covering, we'll cover like how to properly trim a tree for the health of the tree or bush or whatever it is. We've been trying to provide more resources on invasive species, what those look like, how to identify them so that Preserve Stewards can let us know when they're on our properties, and also the ones where hand pulling can be an effective treatment. So if they're willing to hand pull subspecies, they can, and that varies from property to property. Sometimes, like garlic mustard is a great example that Chris Smith brought up, which was that hand pulling can be an effective method, but if there's a lot of it in one, it may not be the most worthwhile effort to hand pull. Because what I don't want as Preserve Stewards going out there and doing something like that and not seeing any progress. Because like Mark said, you want to accomplish something. And if you're just pulling it and then you see it all grow back up the next year, then that's going to be very disheartening. So providing that training, and we try to, add different things to gain everybody's knowledge base, but really have everyone meet each other. Whenever we have a new Preserve Steward, I'm sending them the position description, making sure they understand the roles, and then we meet out on the property that new person will be watching over. And we're discussing, more about what is expected in the role, and also kind of the specifics of that property. So hopefully they feel like they have a sense of background. We're also providing, we provide background information about like when the land trust acquired that land, what are some like very brief like management goals of that property, the background, how did it get acquired by the land trust, different things like that. So providing information on that property, and then kind of regular check-ins. So and that's a big aspect of what I think the staff provides for our Preserve Stewards, is just a contact person, not just writing reports and feeling like they go into the void, I hope, and that they're being used to make plans and things like that. And then like Mark mentioned, like a lot of times, even though our Preserve Stewards may be assigned to a certain property, anytime we do stewardship work out on the lands, like for a work day, I'm sending that information to all of our Preserve Stewards too, so that they know that that's happening, and notifying them of any staff changes. Like, hey, don't be concerned, we mowed that field. Like that was staff, like that was supposed to happen, or something like that. So trying to improve that communication as well.
What's the most effective way that you've found to maintain communication with stewards?
Well, I think it kind of depends on the individual volunteer and how to best contact them sometimes. For me, it's email, because I can send information out to similar information out to everyone at the same time, so everyone's staying on board. And also then I like email because it allows volunteers to kind of, if it's not something urgent, it allows them to look on their own time, like when they have time to go through and communicate. But if it's something a little bit more urgent, usually a phone call will be kind of how we operate that way.
Yeah.
The landscape app also does a nice job of communicating, because of not only the pictures and the GPS, but it does allow commentary in there, so that, if I see something out at Lawton Rock Woods that I'm not real sure about, I can ask the question, is this okay? Or were you aware of this? That type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Chris is mentioning, so when we say landscape, it's a software that the land trust uses to do a lot of our land work, both land acquisition work and land stewardship work. And so we've just recently, this past year, started working, allowing volunteers to access that and use that for reporting for Preserve Stewards. And what's nice about that and having that on your phone is we have GPS location. So I think one of the, like, before it would be like, okay, there's a down tree over the trail. It's like, like after you take the first turn and then you go a little bit farther past the maple tree or whatever, like it's down over there and it's about this wide. And now Chris can send a picture and it has a GPS point. This is where the tree is. This is what it looks like. This is how wide it is. So you know better about what equipment need to go out. And so I think that has been huge, like really convenient in terms of staff knowing what is happening out there. Is otherwise it was a lot of just like emailing a bunch of photos back and forth. And with that GPS information can be super helpful. And it's, I think, helpful too for Chris and Mark and some of our other Preserve Stewards, because it provides them with a kind of like a GPS. It provides them with the boundaries of their nature preserve, so they can see where they are in relation to where the boundaries are of that property. And I think for, you know, when you're staying on the trails, it can be really straightforward, but for some of our preserve stewards who are watching over properties that don't have trails, they're kind of bushwhacking through there. And so it's easier for them to see where they are in relation to the boundaries of that property.
And also if you're a nutball like me that, you know, sort of wanders everywhere on Mountainbach Woods that has nothing to do with the trails, you know, I'm also going out to the end of the boundaries fairly frequently, and I'm sure Paige has been aware of, which she's seen my track, you know, that I'm purposely looking at the boundary edges as well, just to see, you know, if I find a bench out here in the middle of nowhere, you know, then I would question, is this really on our property? Or, you know, did maybe a neighbor kind of encroach and they put something within our property borders that really shouldn't be there? You know, and I've run into a few things like that where I've gone out on the borders and just, you know, questioned, do we have encroachment? Do we have an issue here?
Yeah, for any of
Paul?
the Northeast Wisconsin Land Trust people watching, we are aware of landscape, but we are definitely interested in getting it. We've had some, you know, talk among staff about getting it, attended some different sessions with the landscape folks. Fortunately, you know, for better or worse, for good, we're trying to make a lot of software upgrades over the past year. So we've been updating like all of our payment processing software. We're this close to getting a new website, maybe, hopefully. If you've been on our website lately, it's not very good, but it will be much better any day now. I've been saying any day now for a few months at least, but I think we're close to actually any day now. So at some point, as we're starting to work through these things, landscape is on the list of new software to try to get and start to integrate into our work. Just a matter of finding, you know, the right funding and the right amount of time to make sure we can transition to over it all that smoothly. But it's very good to hear from other land trusts like Door County that they make effective use of landscape to know that, hey, this is a good thing. We are on the right track to try to look into getting this for our purposes.
Yeah,
Paul?
useful, but a lot of trial and error.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Paul if any of the other people on the Zoom call have any questions for either Chris or Paige or me. Anything you'd like to ask us?
Yeah. Open up to free questions from Tom, James, or Chris.
Sure, Mark and Chris, I'm just curious what your backgrounds are, before you joined, your respective land trusts. What did you do? What kind of a backgrounds do you have?
Well, I guess I'll go first and Chris, you can go, but I worked in business, so I had a career, but my passion is the outdoors. I've been a hiker and backpacker for over 60 years. So I have this background in the mountains and trails and outdoors. So that's why when I retired, I chose to volunteer.
Yeah, and in fact, I am still working. And I work part-time at a job, and I in the printing industry for more than 50 years, and I'm still in the printing industry. I just don't run presses anymore. But because I'm a kayak junkie and I have a couple of great big sea kayaks that I go way out in Lake Michigan, obviously I'm an outdoor kid, and I also own about 26 acres up toward Jacksonport that I have owned for some 32 years. And when I first got the property, it was basically an unused farm field and grazing land. And I've worked over the past 30 some years. It was a place where I wanted to, because it was on Hibbard's Creek, I wanted to try to restore it. And when I first bought it, went to the Door County Soil Service and picked up 200 trees and thought that maybe if I got 50% of my pine trees to go, it would be a good thing. And now you go out there and you can't even see across the field for the amount of trees that grew up by the road. I've also done things out there like, I've cleared areas or kept areas cleared that I wanted to have a combination of kind of prairie plants. So if you went out there nowadays you would find a big open field area on my acreage that's just solid little blue stem. And I've got coneflower that I've got going out there. I've got liatris that's going out there. Pussy toes, I've got all kinds of prairie plants that are going in what was a former farm field. So, you know, having that kind of love of being outdoors on my little piece of property just inspires me when I go to our land trust property and try to keep those to be in the best condition that they can possibly be. You know, you just do this little bit here and you do this little bit here and this little bit here. And after a while, you start to see a real big change.
Thanks for your question, Chris. Other questions? Want a follow-up, Chris?
I'm just going to say it's really encouraging to hear your backgrounds, you know, that you don't have to have extensive experience, let's say, you know, in the naturalist arena, that, you know, you've got more, I would say normal, you know, backgrounds that allowed you to be successful doing this. It's good to hear.
And I just want to add that I think that's quite common amongst our 35 or so Preserve stewards, that I think having a background, I think the most relevant background maybe would be a background in landscaping that a couple of our Preserve stewards have. But for the most part, it's folks that, yeah, had careers and other things but have that interest and that love of the outdoors and wanted to get more involved with that. And it's a really cool opportunity to get involved with our organization if you're someone who needs a flexible schedule, because it's something you can do on your own time. So whenever you have the ability to go out and check, whether that's on the weekends or, you know, during the week, or, you know, on Wednesdays or in the morning before you start your day. So there's a lot of flexibility with that in that sense. And I think that has been a big reason why I know some volunteers that I've talked to that are new have veered towards this particular volunteer opportunity, is because it's something they can kind of do. It has a very flexible schedule, I guess you could say.
And on our end of things, definitely our goal will be to create something similar that allows anyone to participate. I mean, I think we would need at least a minimum of like 18 years old if we're sending people out on preserves for legal reasons. But beyond that, anyone who, you know, is vaguely interested in, you know, protecting our lands and learning a little bit more about nature along the way, my goal is to try to create, you know, a system where anyone can come in and participate, and we'll offer the necessary support to learn the things that you need, but not make it where you need to know too much of anything either. But on the other end, if you happen to know a lot of stuff or happen to start learning a lot of things about, you know, your particular preserve, or, you know, you find that you love birds all of a sudden or something like that, where you can then use that love as well and use that knowledge to try to, you know, support our broader conservation efforts. That's the goal, at least. We'll see how it all goes. Any other questions from anyone in the audience?
You know, I noticed, Paul, that some of your lands that you protect are quite large, you know, that they encompass a lot of territory. Do you think you're going to need more than one steward for some of those properties, or, you know, just based on, you know, what occurs, you know, is one going to be sufficient?
I'm saying the goal for one right now, just because I'd rather start with a smaller goal and be able to meet that goal than not be able to meet that goal. But I definitely do anticipate, you know, some properties might end up needing more than one steward. Some properties might have more than one steward, you know, even if it's not necessarily necessary. But, you know, like some of our properties down here in Appleton area or Green Bay that are more accessible might have multiple people stewarding it. Some, like Oconto is probably our biggest one. And that one I'm not honest, it's also the furthest away, so I'm not totally sure what the needs will be, because I'm not able to get up there often enough to have a good sense of what the needs would end up being for some of those larger properties. I haven't been here long enough either to get super familiar with it. So it's definitely possible. I definitely, you know, the goal is one per property approximately, but definitely going to be seeing how the needs develop. Depends on what that one person is able to do, depends on what needs we're able to meet. Definitely would not be looking to limit ourselves to one per property, I would say.
I just wanted to add that some of our nature preserves have more than one steward on them. And that is for a huge variety of reasons.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's because that particular preserve is more frequently visited by the public, so it is better to have more regular feedback on those properties. And so having more than one person means that it's kind of split in terms of the work. Sometimes it's a couple. It's just like a partnership, or two friends that wanna, or just folks that are interested, and they both live near the area, live near that preserve. So it just makes sense to we kind of have both of them on our list per se as people we can contact that live near that property. And that can be highly valuable as well. Or maybe one person that lives right next door but can't get out there, or isn't as interested in some of the aspects, but then there might be another person that maybe lives a little bit farther away, but they are very interested in like doing more of that biological monitoring or something like that too. So, we leave it very flexible in terms of, but I totally get where you're coming from, Paul. It's like, because we're starting out, it would be good to just like see what the
Yeah.
need is first. But yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Because I have one final question, or probably final question. How do you go about recruiting for stewards? What sort of strategies do you use to try to bring people into this program?
Well, I feel like for a good portion of the program, so I came into the program existed before my role within as the kind of like staff member kind of coordinating the program. And I believe a lot of those volunteers came in because they lived adjacent to the property. And so they were involved with stewarding the property, some of them before it even fell into the Door County Land Trust ownership. And so they truly are the main stewards of the property in that sense. Other people, it'll be a conversation. So we have like a volunteer form people can fill out online, and they can indicate what they're interested in volunteering with the land trust in. And a lot of it came from just having conversations with those people that said they were interested in the outdoors, they live in a specific area, and they're looking for, those volunteer opportunities that are more flexible with schedule, and maybe within their capabilities. And it's like, oh, you live near a place that we have an opening. Would you possibly be interested in this? And then sending that position description and kind of going more over what the role entails. And I'd say that has been a huge part of it, with filling in the gaps, is going, okay, what volunteers do we have that live near that preserve?
Yeah.
But also, like, I want to say at least one person, and I can't remember who, or one other, they talked to Mark. And Mark was like, this is what I do. And they're like, oh, that's very interesting. I wonder if I can do that. And then they got in contact with me, and we found a preserve that needed a steward. And so record keeping will be huge, Paul, in terms of who's at what property and where. Setting those goals of where you need folks can be huge too, because just putting the need out there, like, hey, we need preserve stewards in this area, can be big. But yeah, so other preserve stewards, being an ambassador, but also just looking at your current volunteer base, and maybe the folks on this call are interested. And so reaching out to them and having those conversations.
I was going to suggest, if you haven't done that already, is put some signage out at those different sites that you have, either with part of your kiosk, if you have a kiosk there, but people read those things, and it's a great way to get people interested.
Signage is another one of those things that we're looking to maybe invest more in at some point in the future. We've got like some little basic signs at most of our preserves, but hoping to try to boost some of that again when the money and opportunity aligns for that. That's the goal, at least. All right, well, if no one has any other questions, I will go ahead and sign off here. I will be sending out this recording to all people who registered and probably sharing it with our broader Land Trust audience as well. So you'll get the recording at some point here this afternoon if you want to look back and watch yourselves talk or refresh your memory on any things of that sort. Again, for anyone who is watching this recording or is here right now, I'll be trying to follow up with people that are interested in this Preserve Steward program. Hopefully sometime in November, maybe having some sort of group discussion time, collecting feedback in other ways from people as well over the coming next few months, with the goal of by next spring, next summer, really getting something underway to have people going out into preserves and then, send data back to me. All right,
nice
thank
to talk
you,
with everybody.
Paige, Mark, and Chris for joining us.
All right, thank you
Best
much.
of luck.
Yeah,
Well,
best
thank
of luck.
you.
Thank you for inviting
Thank
us.
you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
I'll talk to y'all later.
Bye.